The awl was the last thing she packed. Josephine Wark had spent the morning of September 28, 1901, sorting through every possession that was genuinely hers in the farmhouse outside Dunmore, Ontario. The clothes she wore, a winter coat that had seen better years, $41.60, in a cloth purse her mother had sewn before Josephine was old enough to remember her, and the tools. Gilbert Prue's tools, wrapped in their leather roll, each one sleeping in its worn little pocket like something that knew it was beloved. The awl she picked up last. It was a simple thing, a wooden handle, smooth from decades of use, worn lighter on one side where Gilbert's thumb had rested 10,000 times or more. The iron point was still true. She curled her fingers around the handle and felt the familiar weight of it, the way it sat in her palm, as if it had always been meant to be there. Then she tucked it into the roll with the rest and tied the strap closed. We should tell you something about Gilbert Prue, the cobbler of Dunmore, before we go any further. Because this story, in the way that matters most, begins with him. Gilbert Prue had been the cobbler of Dunmore for 32 years. He was a small, quiet man with a fringe of white hair and the most precise hands anyone in the county had ever seen. He had taken on Josephine as an informal apprentice when she was 14, and her father, Alton Wark, had died in a logging accident at the Braddock timber camp, 4 miles north of town. Josephine had no mother. She had gone to fever when Josephine was 3, and her only living relative was her father's brother, Desmond Wark, who had agreed to take her in with the air of a man making a significant sacrifice for which he expected to be well compensated in time. Gilbert had seen the girl sitting on the steps of the Mercantile 2 weeks after the funeral, not crying. She was past that already, but simply watching the street with the careful, measuring eyes of someone who understood that things had changed in ways she could not yet calculate. He had walked over, sat down beside her, and told her that if she had nothing to do that afternoon, he had a pair of boots that needed resoling, and he could use an extra pair of hands. That afternoon became 8 years. He taught her everything: how to read the wear on a sole and know a person's gait from the marks they left, how to select leather by touch, by smell, by the way it bent between the fingers, how to cut a pattern true, how to set a rivet, how to use a lasting iron, how to wax a thread so it passed through without drag. He taught her to use the awl, his awl, the one with the worn handle, as an extension of her own hand, not as a separate tool, but as a thought made physical. He died in February of 1901 at the age of 74, quietly, in the chair behind his workbench, with a boot in his lap and half a stitch done. He left no will, no family, and no estate worth speaking of. His rented shop and its contents reverted to the building's owner. The tools, his tools, he had pressed into Josephine's hands 3 days before the end, when he was still lucid enough to know what he was doing. "Take these," he had said. His voice was a dry whisper. "They're the only thing I've got that's worth passing on." She had nodded, her throat closed around any words she might have managed. "You know how to use them better than I did by the end," he said. He almost smiled. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." By September, Desmond Wark had made his position clear. He was a man of 53, with a shrewd eye for the bottom of a ledger, and no particular warmth for anyone who could not improve his circumstances. He had managed the Wark farm since Alton's death, and he had managed it in a way that left very little for anyone except Desmond. Now that Josephine was 22, and no longer a child who required keeping, he informed her over supper one evening that she would need to make different arrangements. He had a man in mind, he said, a widower outside Barrie who needed a wife and had offered a reasonable arrangement. Otherwise, she was to be out by the 1st of October. She had looked at him across the supper table for a long moment. The lamp between them made his face look carved from yellow wood. She said, "I'll be out by the 1st of October." He had not expected that. She could see it in the faint twitch at the corner of his eye. He had expected argument, perhaps tears, certainly pleading. He had not prepared for the flat, level answer of a person who had already decided something. She spent the next 3 evenings at the kitchen table, doing what Gilbert had always told her was the first task in any hard situation: making a proper accounting. On one side of a page she wrote what she had, $41.60, the tool roll with Gilbert's full set, the awl, the lasting pincers, the bone folder, the curved needles, the welt knife, the block of beeswax, the 2 lasts for forming, her winter coat, her clothes, her mother's purse, and her trade, the 8 years of it, the knowledge in her hands. On the other side of the page, she wrote what she faced: no shop space, renting even a single room in Dunmore's Mercantile building ran $3 a month, and she had no guarantor, no references she could lean on. The cobbler who had taken over Gilbert's shop after his death was a man named Ira Potts, who had made it plain, in the cheerful tone of a man who considered himself entirely reasonable, that he had no use for a woman on the workbench. The nearest town with other cobbler operations was Collingwood, 26 miles south, and she had no way of knowing if they'd take her seriously either. Winter was 6 weeks away. She looked at the two columns for a long time. The arithmetic was wrong in every direction she tried to run it. $41, spent carefully, would last 3 months in the cheapest boarding house she knew of, and that presumed she found work immediately. There was no work immediately. There was barely work at all for a woman who wanted to use her hands for something other than laundry or cooking. For men who thought a woman knowing a trade was either charming or suspicious, depending on their mood. She could go to Collingwood. She could spend half her money getting there and find the same closed doors, wearing different faces. She could go to Toronto, where at least the city was large enough to be anonymous. But anonymity cost money too, and the city had no particular reason to care about one more young woman with a tool roll and no fixed address. The lamp burned low. She did not refill it. She sat in the dark for a while and let the fear move through her cleanly, the cold, specific fear of a creature who can see the edge of the cliff and cannot yet see the bottom. Then she did what Gilbert had always done when a problem seemed larger than the materials at hand. She went back to the beginning. She picked up his pattern book. It was a battered thing, a cloth-covered ledger he had carried for 20 years, filled with his small, precise handwriting and his careful sketches. He had recorded every pair of boots he'd made of note, every repair that had taught him something, every measurement and material and technique worth remembering. Josephine knew the book nearly by heart. She had read it a dozen times. But she had not read it since he died. She brought it to the table and started at the beginning, working forward. His handwriting was so familiar, it was like hearing his voice. She found herself slowing down, reading things she had only skimmed before, his marginal notes, his observations on places and people and landscapes that she had always taken as his habit of recording the world accurately. On a page dated July of 1894, there was a sketch she had seen before but never studied. It showed a rough map, a creek, a ridgeline, a south-facing clearing. He had written in his careful hand, Braddock Timber, Camp No. 3, north of Dunmore, 4 miles by the old logging trace. Repaired boots for the foreman W. Cade and 6 of his men, 3 days' work. Good camp, well situated. The south clearing catches sun all morning. Creek runs clean. Stone foundation on the old cookhouse. Very sound 2 rooms, mostly intact roof when I last saw it. She turned 2 pages forward. He had gone back in the autumn of 1896. The notes were longer this time. Camp No. 3 abandoned now. Braddock moved operations north after the fire. Nobody using this site. The cookhouse is still standing. I asked at the land office in Barrie about the status of this parcel. Crown land, Lot 9, Concession 4, Pelton Township. The Braddock lease ran to 1898. Clerk told me they had not seen a renewal filed. The ground is good. The building is sounder than it looks from outside. The stone foundation will hold another 50 years. A person who knew what they were doing could winter there comfortably. Josephine sat very still. She read the entry again. Crown land, lease not renewed. She read it a 3rd time. She thought about Camp No. 3. She had never been there, but she had heard the men talk about it, the way people talked about things that used to matter and no longer did. Nobody went up there anymore. There was no reason to. The timber had been cut, the company had moved on, and the land sat in that state of useful obscurity that forgotten things settle into. Gilbert had written it plainly, in 1896. A person who knew what they were doing could winter there comfortably. He had not been writing about himself. He was 69 years old in 1896 and had no intention of wintering anywhere except behind his own workbench. He had been making an observation, a craftsman's note on materials that were going to waste, on potential that no one was using. He could not have known that he was writing her a map. She pressed the book flat against her chest. The fear from earlier was still present, but it had changed shape. It was smaller now and had something underneath it, something that felt, carefully, like a direction to walk in. She had $41, her tools and her trade. She had a dead man's careful record of a place that might belong to no one. She would not go to Collingwood. She would not go to Toronto. She would go north, 4 miles, up the old logging trace and see what Gilbert had seen. If it was nothing, If the roof had gone, if someone else was there, if she had misread everything, she would take her money south and try her luck there. But if it was what the pattern book said it was, she thought, then she had something better than luck. She had knowledge, and no one could take knowledge from her. She was at the door with her pack before Desmond Wark was up the following morning. She did not leave a note. The logging trace was still there, though barely. The bush had been reclaiming it for 4 years, and in places it was more suggestion than path. Josephine walked steadily, her pack on her back, the tool roll wrapped in canvas and lashed alongside. The morning was cold and gray, the light coming sideways through birch and poplar. Her breath came in white puffs. She followed the track north by the gap in the canopy, and the occasional cut stump still visible under a decade of moss. She found the clearing at 10:30. The first thing she noticed was the light. The cookhouse sat at the top of a gentle rise with the clearing opening south and east, and even on a gray morning the sky felt larger there than it did among the trees. The second thing she noticed was the building itself. Low, solid, chinked log construction, with a stone foundation that sat level and true, without a visible crack. The roof, split cedar shingles, a good number of them missing, a birch sapling growing through a gap on the west end, was the problem. But the bones of the thing were sound. She could read it the way she read wear patterns on a boot sole. The damage was in the surface, not in the structure. She walked the full perimeter first. The foundation was precisely what Gilbert had described. 2 rooms, solid dry-laid stone, set deep enough that 4 decades of frost hadn't shifted it. The logs were old-growth pine, slow-grown and dense, aged to a hard gray durability that new lumber couldn't match. She pushed on the walls and they did not move. She tested each door frame with her shoulder and found them straight. The interior was dim and cold, smelling of mouse and old smoke, and the flat iron smell of a wood stove that had sat empty for years. The stove was still there. She walked to it and ran her hand along the top. The iron was pitted with rust but intact. The firebox, when she opened it, was dry. No rot, no nesting she could not clear. The flue pipe was missing a section near the ceiling, but that was a manageable repair with the right piece of tin. She stood in the center of the larger room and turned a slow circle, seeing it as it could be. The stove against the north wall, drawing cleanly, the south windows pulling in the morning light, her bench along the east wall, the tool roll open and laid out in its proper order, the smell of leather and beeswax gradually replacing the smell of absence. She had never built anything in her life. But Gilbert had believed above all things in the principle of looking at what was actually there, before deciding what was impossible. What was actually there was a building that needed a roof and a length of stovepipe and a thorough cleaning. None of that was impossible. It was only work. She spent the rest of that day in Dunmore buying what she needed. She stayed 2 nights at a boarding house, $1 a night, which was painful, and spent both days at Porter & Sons Hardware on Colborne Street, calculating costs with a stub of pencil on the back of a receipt. Tar paper for the roof, tin stovepipe sections, flour, salt pork, coffee matches, tallow candles, nails. When she carried her supplies to the counter on the second morning, the man behind it, Joel Ferrer, in his early 60s, with a face like weathered cedar, looked at her list and then looked at her. He said, "That's a long way north for a woman by herself." She said, 4 miles, I've walked further." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You're Alton Wark's daughter, the one that worked for old Gilbert." She said, "Yes." He said nothing further. He tallied the bill, and when he gave her the total, it was 30 cents less than she had calculated. She looked at the receipt. He said, "I may have miscounted the nails." She looked at him. He said, "Gilbert Prue patched my family's boots every spring for 30 years. Good man." He paused. "I hope the building is sound." She said, "The foundation is excellent." He nodded once, like he understood that the foundation was the only part that mattered. What followed were 26 days of the hardest work Josephine had ever done, and she had worked hard her entire life. She addressed the roof first, because without a sound roof, nothing else could be made right. She shingled over the worst gaps with the tar paper, cutting and tacking it in overlapping rows, while balanced on the ridgepole with her legs hooked around the peak. It was dangerous work and she knew it. She took her time. She tested each foothold before trusting it with her weight. The missing section of stovepipe she fashioned from a piece of flat tin, bending it around a log to get the right diameter and sealing the seam with a putty of wood ash and creek clay. A field repair Gilbert had described once in the pattern book for a camp stove he had serviced years before. She lit a small test fire and sat back on her heels and watched the smoke. It drew cleanly up and out through the fissure in the ceiling. Something loosened in her chest. The chinking she did with clay and dried moss packed tight with a stick, working around the interior first and then the outside. She learned that it needed to go in wet, be tamped firm, and be laved to cure fully before the next layer. She made mistakes. She repacked sections 3 times before they held. Her hands were cracked and bleeding by the second week. For firewood, she used the deadfall on the surrounding slopes, dry birch and maple that split cleanly. She stacked it against the south wall beneath a lean-to she had roofed with more tar paper, measuring her pile each evening and calculating burn rates the way she had always calculated thread lengths on a long seam. The pile grew steadily. Each armload she set in place felt like a declaration. By the 26th day, the building was tight, the stove drew well, the wood was stacked, and she had set up her bench along the east wall with Gilbert's tools laid out in their proper order. The awl she placed at the right end, within easy reach. She had not intended it as ceremony. It felt like one anyway. That evening she swept the floor clean, lit a fire in the stove, and sat on an upturned crate, eating salt pork and flatbread, while the warmth spread slowly through the stone foundation and up into the log walls. Outside, the first real cold of the season was moving in from the north. She could hear the pines beginning their low creak in the wind. Inside, the room was warm and dim and hers. She had done it. Word travels in logging country the way water does. It finds the lowest routes and moves faster than you expect. The first man to appear at her door was a faller named Percy Budd, who had heard from a Dunmore merchant that a cobbler had set up north of town. He had a pair of caulk boots with a broken rand that had been giving him grief for a month, and he was willing to pay a fair price. Josephine examined the boots, quoted him 75 cents, and fixed them in under an hour. When Percy Budd laced them up and walked the length of the clearing and back, he said, "Those are better than new." She said, "The leather was good. It just needed proper attention." He told 2 men at his camp. Those men told others. By December, she had more work than she could comfortably manage, and she had raised her prices accordingly. The loggers paid without complaint, because she was the only cobbler within 30 miles who would come out to the camps for fittings, who turned work around in a day, and whose repairs held through a full season of caulk boot work on ice-covered logs. They brought her boots in paper sacks tied to their saddles. They treated her workbench with the particular respect men reserve for work they cannot do themselves. She built a shelf. She built a second bench. She bought a better saw from Joel Ferrer, and he subtracted 30 cents from the bill without explanation or comment. She had begun to feel that she had made a real thing here. Not just a shelter, not just a stopgap, but a place the country needed. She was the cobbler of the North camps. No one had given her that title. It was simply true. In February, a man arrived who was not a logger. His name was Frederick Stoll, and he was a Dominion land surveyor out of Barry. He was polite, thorough, and visibly uncomfortable about what he had come to say. He introduced himself properly and accepted her offer of tea, before he explained that he had been retained by the Braddock Timber Company to survey and assess their northern holdings, including the parcel on which she was currently residing. He laid a map on her workbench without meeting her eyes. He said, "I have to inform you that the company intends to resume activity on this site in the spring and will require the building to be cleared." Josephine looked at the map. She looked at Frederick Stoll. She was 22 years old, and she had built this place with her own hands in 26 days. She was not afraid of him. She said, "When did the company last hold a valid lease on this parcel?" He looked at her with an expression she would remember for a long time, the expression of a professional who has asked something he did not expect to be asked back. He said, "That information would be held at the land office in Barry." She said, "I believe the lease expired in 1898 and was not renewed. I have documentation that supports that." She set Gilbert's pattern book on the bench. She opened it to the July 1894 entry, and then to a second entry she had found only the week before, dated October of 1898, in which Gilbert had noted, on a supply trip through Barry, that he had stopped in at the land office to inquire about the parcel, and been told by the clerk on duty that no renewal had been filed, and that the land had reverted to Crown status. He had recorded the clerk's name, a Mr. A. Slack, with the date and office noted in the margin. Frederick Stoll read both entries carefully. His face changed as he read. He asked if he might take the book to compare against the records in Barry. She said he could not. but she copied the relevant passages out in full, in her own hand, precisely, including the dates and the clerk's name, and she gave him the copy. He left without making any further mention of the spring clearing. What she heard 3 weeks later was Frederick Stoll himself riding out to the clearing on a morning in early March when the snow had begun to pull back from the south-facing slopes. He sat at her bench with a mug of tea and a folder of papers and explained, in the careful language of someone who takes technical accuracy seriously, that the Braddock Timber Company's lease had indeed expired without renewal in 1898, that the parcel was currently unencumbered Crown land, and that under the provisions of the Ontario Crown Lands Act, an individual who had made genuine improvements and maintained continuous occupation in good faith had a valid basis for an application. He set a form on her workbench. He said, "I'm not required to give you this." He paused. "But Gilbert Prue made the boots I wore every day for 10 years. I figured I owed him something." Josephine looked at the form for a long moment. Then she picked up the awl from the end of the bench, not to use it, only to hold it, the handle worn smooth on one side from a thumb that was no longer there to rest against it. She said, "How long does the application take?" Frederick Stoll said, 6 months to a year, but once it's filed, the occupation stands. She set the awl down, dipped her pen, and filled out the form at her own workbench, in clear ink, in her careful. The land was Lot 9, Concession 4, Pelton Township. The applicant was Josephine Wark. The basis of claim was improvements made and maintained, continuous occupation since September 28, 1901, and documented evidence of prior Crown ownership. She did not hear from the Braddock Timber Company again. What she heard at second hand was that the man in their Barrie office who had directed Frederick Stoll to carry the notice of eviction had been replaced not long after. Whether that was related or coincidental, she could not say. Justice, she found, was often a quiet and administrative thing. A series of papers changing hands in offices she would never visit, decisions made by men she would never meet. It did not look the way she had imagined it might. It felt colder and more practical, and she found she did not mind that. She had never needed a scene. She had only needed the land. The parcel was granted in the autumn of 1902. She hung the certificate on the wall above her bench, beside the small shelf where she kept Gilbert Prue's pattern book. She could have put the book away in a chest, in a safe place out of reach of the resin and beeswax and leather dust that settled over everything in a working cobbler's shop. She did not. She kept it where she could see it every day. It was not sentiment. It was the same instinct that made a good cobbler keep their sharpest tools within arm's reach. The knowledge that some things are too important to put away. The book had been the difference between destitution and ground she could stand on. Gilbert Prue had not left her money. He had barely had any to leave. He had left her 8 years of knowledge in her hands, and 20 years of careful observation in a battered ledger, and those two things turned out to be worth more than any sum Desmond Wark could calculated. Money ran out. Money could be taken. What she knew and what Gilbert had written down were hers in a way that a deed was, in the end, almost a formality by comparison. She added a room to the south end of the building in the spring. She put in a kitchen garden and a proper woodshed. A young hound that one of the loggers gave her against the winter foxes slept at the foot of the workbench every afternoon. By the following summer there was a hand-lettered sign above the door, J. Wark, Cobbler, and the clearing had the easy, settled feel of a place that had found its purpose. She never left. The awl stayed at the right end of the bench, within reach. She used it every single day. And every time her hand closed around that worn handle, smooth on one side from a thumb that no longer existed in the world, she felt the full weight of what it meant to be trusted with someone's knowledge, and to use it. We think about Josephine Wark sometimes, when people ask what it means to truly inherit something. Not property, not money, not a name or a title, or a deed drawn up by a lawyer in a warm office. What it means to receive knowledge from someone who trusted you enough to teach you everything they knew, and to discover, in the worst moment of your life, that it was sufficient, that it was, in fact, the only thing that ever could have been. She had not been rescued. She had read a dead man's careful handwriting by lamplight, followed it 4 miles through the bush on a gray September morning, and built something out of it with her own hands and borrowed tools. That is not the story of someone who was saved by fortune. That is the story of someone who understood what she had been given, and was brave enough to use it. Before you go, we'd like to ask you something. There is someone in your past, a grandparent, a parent, An old teacher, a friend who is no longer here, who once showed you how to do something, taught you a skill, shared an observation, pressed something into your hands and said, "Take this, it's worth more than I can tell you." You may not have fully understood it at the time. You may not have thought about it in years. What would it mean? In the hardest moment you can imagine, to finally remember that they gave it to you.